Okay, this is Bible Basics episode 12, and I'm going to title this one, Ehrman versus Eusebius, and you'll understand why I did that as we proceed. 2 episodes back, I talked to you about modern biblical scholarship, how it was a departure from the historic or traditional scholarship regarding the Bible. It was associated with the Renaissance and I guess the Enlightenment, even more than that, and new ways of thinking, a new way of analyzing, basically taking a secularized view of the Bible and wanting to separate scholars from any sort of position of faith, any sort of position of ever getting to the point of faith. And I've tried to explain that I think it's fine, and I think it's perfectly appropriate and even desirable to approach the Bible, from a unassuming point of view. In other words, not making assumptions, just taking it at face value, and then making decisions about whether or not it is reliable history, whether it is not, whether or not the testimony therein is plausible and persuasive. But once you've gone through that analysis and you've made a decision, and you should make a decision, there's no reason why you can't make a decision. You do make a decision, and you come to recognize that this is compelling, this is truth, this is the only way really to reject what the New Testament is saying, what the Bible is saying, but especially the New Testament, since it's the newest part of the Bible, the closest to our time, the easiest to grasp its meaning. Or to what it's saying, that it's perfectly appropriate to say, yes, there's never been a man like Jesus of Nazareth, and God was certainly with him. There can be no reasonable doubt about it. And so once you come to that conclusion, then you can learn other things based on that. But if you say, well, no, I even though I believe that, I'm going to set that aside, and I'm just going to continue to read the Bible and study the Bible as if I don't necessarily believe anything that's in it. That is a very counterproductive exercise. You will end up saying some very foolish things. I mentioned one of the names I mentioned was Ehrman. There's a modern Bible scholar named Bart Ehrman. He teaches at the University of North Carolina and has taught there many years, and is just quite the writer. Now, it's natural for any college, university professor to write. It goes with the territory, goes with the job. They're expected to research and to write. But Ehrman does something, and this is something that a certain percentage of scholars will do or try to do, and that is he writes for popular audiences. He'll take the academic focus of his work and then dumb it down is not really a completely fair way to put it, but make it simpler so that lay people can read and understand it in written popular books. What does distinguish him from all other New Testament or Bible scholars is how successful he's been at that. He's been enormously successful. He's written books, all of them basically espousing the modern historical view, but he states things in a very provocative way, which sells books. Book sales thrive on controversy, and Bart Ehrman has been particularly good at that. So he's a competent academic. He has respect in the academic world in which he works, but he's also a very successful published author. Now, one example of his writings is this book called Forged, and the subtitle is Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. You see what I mean by provocative? Very provocative. Now, he's not really, when he says that, why the Bible's authors are not who we think they are, it's very kind of savvy the way he writes it, because when you read the book, you'll find out that of the 27 books in the New Testament, he does concede that 7 of them are written by the authors we think they are. And those are what are called the 7 undisputed Paulines. And in saying that, he's not saying anything that modern scholarship is not saying. That is the general position of modern scholarship. Now, modern Bible scholars are divided into liberal scholars and conservative scholars, and so you can find a fair number of New Testament scholars who will say that no, the other books, were mostly written by who we think they are. But there would be a minority. There would definitely be a minority. But Barth doesn't get into he doesn't get to that level of detail in his subtitle here. All he wants to get across in that subtitle is they're not who you think they are. Well, who do we think they are? Well, we think they are who the New Testament says they are. All the books in the New Testament, from the time that the New Testament was assembled, had writers associated with all 27 books. And the reason we know that is that, well, just because of history, we got a lot of history, but the first church history was written by a man named Eusebius. Eusebius was a church bishop. Back then, that's the way the churches were run. There'd be a bishop over a city or a region, and all the churches would be under his authority. But those bishops were equal in authority to all. One bishop was equal to another bishop. Now, obviously, it's just like cattle ranches. The more cattle you got, the bigger the hat you wear, and the more impressive you are to your peers. But there was no hierarchy, no organization, no pope, no Rome. That would come later. There was a bishop of Rome, but the bishop of Rome was not telling everybody else. They weren't getting their orders from him. He might exercise influence to a fair degree, but other bishops of other large cities would do the same thing. But Eusebius was the first historian, first person to write a history of the church, and he lived around the late 200s, the early 300s. And he was actually around when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian. So part of his historical work was to track these New Testament writings and who were their authors. Well, the books were written in different places and different times by different people, but they were all written for churches. So the churches were the custodians of these. It's like artwork, when a painter paints something and the painter sells it to the first person, there's a chain of custody that starts. Goes from the painter to the person receiving it, and then if there are replicas made, which there were copies made of the New Testament writings, then they get sent around. But the churches were the ones who had these letters. There were no universities as we know them today. There was no centralized archive for these books, like we have the Archive of National Documents in Washington, D.C. for America's founding documents. But it was the churches that kept up with these, so they knew which books came from they knew the authors of the books because that's who they got them from. Now, during that period of time, from the time they were written in the first century until the time they were all put together in one collection called the New Testament, was about 300 years. And that, during that time, the copies were being made and circulated widely. And these churches were reading these in their services. There were basically, all the churches were patterned off of Jewish synagogues. Jewish synagogues would gather, and they would read the scriptures because people couldn't have the scriptures at home, too expensive, too bulky, no place to put them. And so they would go to church, and a lot of people didn't read, so that they would go to church to hear what the scriptures said. Well, when the apostles would go around and start at these synagogues, the people would learn of the gospel, and the people who believed would continue forward. They'd be called to church, and they would continue reading what they had been reading, which was the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And then they would read, a letter or two or a gospel from what we call the New Testament. So when these different churches started, once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, each church started publishing a list of what they read. Well, anyway, it was during that period of time that Eusebius was tracking all these churches and find out, hey, which ones are valid, because there were a lot of forgeries running around back then. There were many more forgeries than there were authentic writings. People would forge for different reasons. And Ehrman talks about a fair amount of that, but he doesn't really engage with Eusebius. He doesn't explain why, and he's speaking on behalf of modern scholarship, but he doesn't take any time in this book to explain why he's rejecting the findings of Eusebius and other scholars from ancient times as to who wrote those books. These ancient scholars, they went through scores of documents. There was like Gospel of Peter and Gospel of Judas and Gospel of Thomas, and they viewed all these, and they were not authentic. They were not written by those actual apostles. And oddly, Ehrman will quote Eusebius in his book, but it's only when Eusebius says something that affirms the point that Ehrman wants to make. But Ehrman never acknowledges in his book that when he says why the Bible's authors are not who we think they are, that he's arguing with Eusebius and Eusebius's contemporaries like Athanasius and Augustine, Jerome, other men who were tracking these different books. So when the New Testament was originally collected and put together, all the authors were known. But modern scholars, because they ignore that, they look at these and they say, well, it's hard to know exactly what they say, because they act like, the modern scholars act like the ancient scholars never wrote on this. They just ignore them. And they take advantage of the ignorance of modern readers. Bart Ehrman's students at the University of North Carolina and people that buy books of his like this in the bookstores or on Amazon or wherever they buy them, they don't know a lot of this history, and say that they don't know that modern scholars are ignoring ancient scholars on the subject of who wrote these books. Now I ask you, who has the greater ability to know who wrote these books than people who lived back then? Why can modern people say they know more when they got far less evidence? The trail is cold in terms of the investigative trail. How are they going to figure them out? These ancient leaders identified 27 undisputed books. Undisputed, not in the sense that no single person ever said that they disagreed with the authorial ascription, but just that there was a common consent. They never had to vote on this. They had church councils back then. Once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, they had church councils, but they never had to vote on which books got in the Bible. So I can see I've run out of time for this one. I'll continue it on the next time. Ehrman versus Eusebius. I'm going with the guys who were there.